All right, Biz 101. Today we're going to be talking about managing human resources. This is one of my favorite chapters to cover in the entire text because it's my discipline and I'm a big believer in the power of HR, especially in modern organizations. So we're going to be talking about how labor fits within organizations and how companies use specific departments and practices to make sure we're hiring, developing, and training the right people for the right jobs, and also anticipating where we're going to need people. So let's start off today. We're going to start off by talking about how HR can be done incorrectly. This is a little story from back in my previous career. I used to work in the world of technology, and we were initiating a project at the Pennsylvania Career Links. The Career Links are a series of places within Pennsylvania, they're state-run, where you can go to find a job. Well, the Career Links had a fantastic idea. They wanted to install video conferencing units so they could bring in remote sign language interpreters for deaf individuals, people who used American Sign Language. What a great idea. And the concept was that the deaf individual could come into the location through the Career Link, be able to interview with an employer on site, and remotely have an ASL, an American Sign Language interpreter, to be able to make sure the communications was happening. What a great idea. What a great way to be inclusive, right? I don't know if anybody can guess how they advertised this service. Yes, you guessed it, on the radio. And the point is that in the modern world of HR, in the modern world of working with employees, we have to know what their needs really are. We have to know how to best reach people, and we have to be aware of increasing trends such as diversity, of which American Sign Language of people who don't speak native English, for example, might be a part. So we have to be cognizant of all of these things. So what are we going to be learning in this chapter? What we're going to be learning about is what HR is all about and how we recruit and train and get the right people in the right jobs. What about training? One of the biggest misconceptions I think a lot of people have is that when they get out of college that they have to have absolutely everything on their resume they'll ever need. In reality, almost all employers know they're going to have to train new employees and develop them. And by the way, it takes about 6 months for a new employee to be truly productive. We're also going to be talking about how we use these things called performance appraisals. In other words, how do we determine if somebody's doing a good job or not? Is their poor performance their fault, or are there impediments, or there organizational things, or job design that are causing the problems? How do we compensate and pay people? In other words, do you get paid by the hour? Do you get paid as a salary? What are things that we need to think about? What about unions? What's a union and what role do they play in modern labor? We're not going to be spending as much time on unions in this class because that's actually a pretty dedicated sub-discipline of HR, but you're at least going to be familiar with what unions are. And we're going to be talking about what trends and issues are affecting the way that we recruit and bring people into organizations. So we're going to be covering a very wide range of topics in very little time. So what is HR? Our textbook, I think, has a pretty good definition in the fact that it emphasizes the idea that we're not just managing people, we're hiring people, we're developing them. And what's developing meaning? We're growing them, we're motivating them to accomplish goals, and we're making sure that we're looking back to see if we spent money in the right way or if we've given an employee good direction in the idea of evaluating them. So what it really comes down to is however your business is set up, HR needs to know how your business works. Human resource management needs to know how your business works so that we're hiring the right people to accomplish organizational goals. It's the idea of acquiring talent, developing it, and making sure you're hitting organizational goals. Let me give you an example of how the world has changed. Bill Ford, the former chair of Ford Motor Company, said that he no longer controls a car company. He controls a technology company that happens to make cars. Think about the way a pickup truck looked about 20 or 30 years ago versus the way a pickup looks now. The pickup of 30 years ago did not have a touchscreen, was not controlled by computers, did not have all the bells and whistles of a current F-150, and certainly wasn't made out of aluminum. That means you have to hire different people with different skill sets to be able to keep your business competitive. All of a sudden, the company that's making pickup trucks needs technologists and programmers and people who know how to spot weld aluminum as opposed to steel. So HR needs to be a strategic part of your company's function. Otherwise, you'll never get the right skill sets for the jobs that you have or the ones that you're hoping to work towards. So you need to look at the future as well. So how does HR work? And I apologize that those bottom two diagrams are cut off just a little bit. You'll be able to see those on the slides. HR starts off with the goals for the company. Where do we want to be? How do we want to operate? The first step in HR is what we refer to as job analysis and design. And that means, for example, we're determining, are we actually doing our jobs as efficiently as we could be? The example I always love to use is Subway. Think about the difference of making a sandwich at your house versus how they make a sandwich at Subway. If I'm in my kitchen at home, I have to walk to the refrigerator. Then across the kitchen, maybe there's a little table in the way to go to the bread drawer to get the bread. And then I've got to go back to the refrigerator to get my condiments and maybe my lunch meat, maybe my cheese. If I want to save it for later, I've got to walk over to the pantry and get a sandwich bag. It's not a very efficient process. Subway, however, has a very efficient process set up so that it's very quick and efficient to make a sub. And that's an example of job analysis and design. The initial counters at Subway when the restaurant was founded probably didn't look the way they do now because it was developed over time. And we're also going to plan and forecast. For example, people who are planning and forecasting now, they're looking toward the future. We got a tight labor market right now, which means a lot of employers can't find people to hire. What are they going to do as a result? They're probably going to automate a lot more jobs. So we're going to be planning on having fewer people working for us because they're not available, or we're saving money by automating. Once we know how the jobs are set up, then we recruit. It means we advertise. We put things out on LinkedIn. We put ads out on social media, maybe even newspapers for older employees. And we're trying to get people to come and apply for jobs. Then we interview and we select the folks who we want to be able to hire. Once we have them in the door, we have to train them. We have to get them ready in terms of having them understand our culture and the jobs they have to do. If we're doing training, we're establishing specific skills. If we're developing, we're growing people into leaders. Then a couple of times a year at least, we're going to look back on somebody's performance and see, well, how did you do? How did you do against the standards we have set? Can we evaluate you? Can we give you a raise or not? Then the idea of the performance evaluation goes into compensation and benefits. What are you worth? What should we be paying you? What kind of benefits should we be giving you? And the bottom line on the bottom of the screen, sorry, that's cut off just a little bit, is HR outcomes and retention and turnover. HR outcomes. Do we have an efficient, well-run company? And are people staying or leaving? So again, this is all the basic HR process we're going to be talking through. So let's start off with strategy, goals, and market position. If you are running an HR department, you have to understand what the company does. So many companies have people within them who are recruiting for people in the company who do not understand what the company is really about. So you've really got to be somebody who has an active role, a seat at the table, as it were, for strategic planning. So you're steering the ship. If you've ever seen the TV show The Office, all Toby generally does is come around and tell people what the rules are and when they're breaking them, which is why Michael Scott hates him so much, among many other reasons. We don't want to be Toby. We don't want to just be the bean counter rule enforcer. We want to be the person at the table who is helping predict what kinds of skills we're going to need to hire in the near future. So we have to understand the company's strategies and goals. And that gets us into the next part of HR, which is the idea of actually planning the jobs, recruiting people, and picking the right folks. Again, a job analysis means we're going in and making sure we can see what it takes to do the job. If this were an actual HR class, we'd be talking about some of the methodologies you can use, but we're going to keep it very simple. What we want to determine is what knowledge, skills, and abilities, KSAs, do you need to do the job well? What about the layout of the job? Again, going back to the Subway example, what works well in the actual layout of the job? What a job analysis ultimately means is you're watching somebody work or you're creating a workflow for the first time. From that process, we produce job specifications and job descriptions. What's the difference? Job specifications are the actual fine points that you need to do the job. For example, a job specification for a college professor might be that you at least have a master's degree. A job specification for a college professor might be that you are good at public speaking, you have demonstrated expertise in your field. All of those things go together into a single document, which is called a job description. So the difference between a job specification and a job description: a job specification are the actual skills, knowledge, and abilities you need. A job description is putting it all in one place to kind of describe what the entire position is all about. Well, when we get into planning and forecasting, what we're talking about there is basically determining, as our company grows, or conversely, as our company shrinks, what skills do we need? Are we going to be hiring or firing? Are we going to be pulling in people or letting people go? Are we going to need different skill sets than we have today? That's planning and forecasting. It can be very difficult to predict. When we entered into COVID-19 in March of 2020, for example, we were at roughly 4% unemployment in the United States. And that means we're basically at full employment, which means it was hard to get people to work. All of a sudden, we had slowdowns in the service industry, and a lot of companies had to let people go. Well, after we spent a year letting people go, now companies are having a hard time getting back up to staff because they lost good employees in the course of the pandemic. So COVID-19 and global pandemics changed the way HR works. I'm not going to read this to you, but the job description is this entire document. So it tells you what you do. The job specifications are what actual skills you need. So the document that details what the job is all about is a job description. A job specification are the specific knowledge, skills, and abilities that you need to be able to do the job. So again, when we look at where HR should sit, we should be right at the top of the pyramid. So here we've got up at the top the mission statement, what's driving the company, the folks up top who are making decisions about what the company should be doing, the leadership. Well, human resources needs to be situated there to translate what the leadership wants to do into goals for the company. So we know now that we need to increase production, or we need to change the way we're doing things. Well, what do we do then? Well, do we have people inside the company who can be trained or developed? Do we have an internal supply or not? If we have too many people, we need to maybe get rid of folks. If we have not enough people, we might need to hire. So we're looking at what our demands are, what our predicted demands are going to be, and then we're going to make a decision. If we see that we've got a lack of people, we're going to hire. If we have an excess of people, we're going to get rid of folks. So once we look at, this is our strategy, we're evaluating in HR, we're making a forecast, and we're looking here. If we got too many folks, we might need to reassign people to other places, lay them off, terminate folks, and we basically tell them that they're not coming back. And you can't see this, sorry, it's cut off on the bottom of the screen. Some folks may just need to retire. So early retirements. If we don't have enough folks, we got to hire. Or we can pay overtime to existing folks to get them to work longer hours, or we can subcontract parts of the job out. Again, this is all what HR does. So it's a very strategic function. When we get into recruitment, we've got two kinds of recruiting to get the right person for the right job. We can look at internal or external. If you're recruiting internally, you're giving people a chance to apply for a different job within an organization they already work for. If you're going externally, it means you're recruiting people from other places. There are advantages and disadvantages to both. If you're recruiting people internally, they already know the company. They understand the company. They've shown loyalty. They don't have to be broken in or onboarded. Those are all good things. A disadvantage to recruiting internally means you're not maybe getting new ideas, or if multiple applicants apply for the same job, the person who gets the job may be very happy, but you may unintentionally disenfranchise other people who did not get picked. So that's the difference between internal and external in that regard. External can be advantageous in the fact you're getting new ideas, you're getting new folks coming in, new expertise, maybe even fresh or different ideas. The disadvantages are you got to break them in, and you're also showing the internal employees that you're putting more emphasis on external people. Anytime you promote somebody internally, you're showing that the company believes in growing people. One of the companies that we have in the central Pennsylvania region that really is a good example in this regard is Sheets. They always give opportunities for internal applicants to apply for jobs, and that shows them that they're willing to grow their people. How do we recruit? Well, the old ways are newspapers and magazines putting ads in, maybe in-person job fairs, although we're getting into online and virtual job fairs these days. And again, the online methods are social media, job services, maybe even application sites such as Indeed.com or Glassdoor, and virtual career fairs. So there's lots of ways to reach out to people these points at this point in time. One of the most misunderstood things is the unemployment rate versus the labor force participation rate. Here's the difference. When we say, hey, the unemployment rate is reaching an all-time low, that doesn't mean that everybody in the country is working. The unemployment rate, let's say, for example, right now, the unemployment rate in the United States is roughly 6%. Let's say that's true. That means the percentage of people who are trying to find a job who can't find jobs. That's the unemployment rate. The labor force participation rate is the percentage of the entire population who's eligible to work who is not actively participating in a job search. Generally speaking, in this country, we seldom get beyond 85% labor force participation rate. So let's talk about why that's important. We have the concept of the the employers versus the employees market. When we say it's an employer's market, that means the employer has the advantage. If we have got high levels of unemployment, if it's tough to get a job, employers can pay less because people need jobs. If we have a low unemployment rate, it's an employees market because employees have the advantage. They can ask for higher wages. So right now, just to give you some context as well, let's say that we've got an unemployment rate of 4%. Let's say we get back to pre-pandemic levels. It becomes an employees market because employers run out of people to hire. And that's when employers start wondering, how do I get that last 15%? If we're at 85% labor force participation rate, how do I get some of those folks to get back in the workforce? And that's when people who normally would have a hard time finding a job, people with criminal records, older individuals, persons with disabilities, all of a sudden become more desirable to employers. So that's some context for you. So in terms of the entire process for picking people, we have what we refer to as initial screening. Does somebody apply for the job? And we interview them either online or in person. Then we might do employment testing. That means we're going to ask somebody to prove they can do the job. Then we might do an interview. So, hey, let's see if you're the right fit for our company. Then we're going to do the background checks and reference checks. What did other employers say about you? And then we do a physical examination. And again, a physical examination doesn't always happen. It has to be tied into the job. And then we make the decision to hire or not. A couple of points here. Not all employers will do employment testing. Another point is not all employers will do physical examinations. And finally, if you get to the idea of drug screens, the so-called P-test, it is not legal to ask somebody to take a urine analysis before a conditional offer of employment. So you cannot ask somebody to take a drug screen without a conditional offer of employment. So these are all examples of how the process works. Some companies use all these steps. Some of them use parts of these steps. It's not consistent through all companies. It's an ideal. So there are lots of ways to make mistakes in interviews, and if we were doing an in-person version of this section, we would be doing some sort of an in-person job interview and giving you an opportunity to experience this. I'll let you read that for yourself, how you can make a mistake. But let's continue. We got through the first two sections talking about strategy and talking about job analysis. Now we're going to talk about developing employees. Let's get in. So you've got several methods of training and development. The most common is what we refer to as OJT, on-the-job training. And that means, for example, when somebody gets oriented, we bring them in and tell them about the company. You might even have other employees, existing employees, kind of break them into what the company is all about, the company culture. Job rotation simply means you're having somebody work multiple jobs within the company. That can, number one, give them training. Number two, give them the layout of the company. And number three, can also determine maybe if they've got an aptitude in a particular area. So we can see, oh, that person would be really good in this department. Apprenticeships are often used in the trades. So we're going to have somebody who's gotten hired as a new carpenter or an electrician, apprentice and work under an experienced person. And in a less formal manner, we've got mentoring, which means somebody, for example, who's maybe management material gets mentored by a more experienced manager to treat them in a way that they are growing and learning on the job. Then we also have what we refer to as off-the-job training, which means you could send somebody for training on a computer or a simulation, or even just conduct classes, things that involve training that's not hands-on per se, not during the workplace. So how does this process work? The first we see when we are training somebody, whether they're a new employee or whether they're some employee that we need to give a new skill. The first is, what's the assessment? What new skill do we need? What does this person not already possess that they need to possess? And that gives us our training objectives. An example might be, we have a new piece of customer service software. So all of our customer service representatives need to be conversant with that piece of software. That's our objective. So we design a training program. Maybe we send them to a simulation site. Maybe we actually put them in a live situation where they're working with the software with real customers. We design the program. After we design it, then we conduct the training, which means we saw these are the needs. We saw our assessment. We know what our objective is. We design the program. We're actually going to train people. After people get trained, we're going to test them and see how well they did. Well, how did they do, and how did the actual training itself work? Did the person do a good job or not? Or was the training poorly designed? And again, that goes back, and the feedback for training improvement gets applied to all the steps. So we go back and look, how well did the training work? Do we need to do it again? And well-run companies are always constantly reevaluating their needs for training so they can be up to date on the latest. So in terms of performance evaluation, that means we're going to evaluate how well you've done your job. Have you functioned to the level in which you were hired to function? How is your performance? Well, a performance appraisal means that we're comparing how well you performed with our expected standards. If you work at McDonald's, you were expected to make 35 hamburgers an hour. Well, you made 40, so you exceeded expectations. And it gives an idea for how the employee is performing, what they're contributing to our bottom line, and also can change standards. Let's say, for example, that our idea was that employees should be able to make 35 hamburgers an hour. Well, nobody on the third shift is getting that. Everybody's getting 20, 24, or 25 hamburgers. It could be that our standards are too high as well. So we may be asking too much of our employees. If everybody's making 50 hamburgers an hour, maybe we need to raise the expectation. Or if we have most people making 35 hamburgers an hour, we've got two folks who are making 40, well, maybe those folks deserve a raise. So that's how we determine compensation. Again, if you're evaluating somebody's performance, it should always be consequential. So how does this process work? Well, you've got to set the standard. What is the expectation? Let me give you an example why that's important. Again, we use the McDonald's example. We've got employee A and employee B. Employee A is making 35 hamburgers an hour. That's what they were expected to do. Employee B is making 45, and hardly anybody is that fast. That doesn't mean that because our first employee is an average employee that they're a bad employee. The danger is, if you only reward extremely good performers, you can disenfranchise the people who are doing adequate performance. So you need to have an objective standard in the first place. So we look at the standard, then we evaluate how is the employee performing these tasks. During the performance evaluation, we talk with them. We see what's working well, what isn't. And finally, at the end of that, we either give rewards or job changes. And what does that mean? Well, a reward could be a bonus. A reward could be a promotion. A job change could be we're putting you in a new position. We're making you a team leader. Or if you're not doing well, maybe we need to give you training. It's a big mistake to only give employees negative feedback. If you only give people negative feedback, they'll only ever perform well enough to not get in trouble. You want to give positive feedback as well. But performance management, your performance evaluation should always have consequence. We typically use something called a BARS, behavioral-based rating schedule. Sometimes they call them BARS. What it comes down to is being able to give some kind of a quantifiable rating on very specific criteria. So that's a behavior-based rating scale. And again, you can read this in the text for yourself. Compensation means that we've got two levels generally that we pay people. There are other ways as well, but the two main differences are wage and salary. If you earn an hourly wage, that means every hour you work, you get paid a certain amount of dollars per hour, and you're eligible for overtime. If you work over 40 hours a week, you get paid time and a half. If you're salary, it means you get paid a flat rate no matter how much work you do or how many hours you put in. Certain people who are salary tend to be executive or leadership or creative roles. People who are hourly tend to be folks who do general production. And then we get into indirect benefits. So we've got benefits such as health insurance, pensions, retirement, or incentive pay. Let's talk about these for a minute. Somebody who gets a benefit is getting something substantial, and I always want to bring this point up because when you get out and start interviewing for jobs, you need to look at what you're really being paid. So let me give you an example. Let's say your first job out of college, you're making $100,000 a year. You got that killer job. And on top of that, your employer is giving you full benefits. They're giving you medical, dental, and retirement. What is your company actually paying you? In truth, that job isn't worth $100,000. Your company is probably paying about $130,000. Your benefits are worth about 30% of your salary on top of your salary, generally speaking. So that's nothing to sneeze at. If you got a choice between a job with no benefits or a job that pays $5,000 a year more with no benefits, think about the. Let me rephrase that. I lost my train of thought. If you get a job with benefits versus a job that costs $5,000 more with no benefits, take the job with the benefits. It probably means more in the long run. And then we get into incentive pay, which means, for example, people who work in sales can earn commissions or profit sharing. So if the company does well, we made $1 million in profit this year. We've got 10,000 employees. We're going to split that $1 million among the employees as profit sharing. And then we get into the final part of today's core HR discussion, which is outcomes. How are we doing? Are our training programs working well? Are we accomplishing our goals? Are customers happy? What are ways that we can tell if we're recruiting and hiring well? Well, again, customer satisfaction, high performance, all these things tell us we're doing a good job. What could be hindering our success, for example? If we see that we've got high turnover or the customers aren't happy, what can we be doing differently? How can we differently develop our employees? We should also be looking at turnover. Are a lot of people leaving? And if so, why? Can we determine what our problems are there? And turnover itself is not necessarily bad or evil. Why is that? Because sometimes you get rid of poor performers, or sometimes you get performers, for example, who bring new ideas by getting new people in by people leaving. So turnover itself is not inherently bad, but we need to look at all these things. If we're spending money on training, we want to know if it's working. How can you tell if you're hiring the right people? Here's a great way I think to look at it. Think about 2 restaurants you've been in. Think about one where the service was great, people seemed happy, and you had a great experience. Think about another time when you went into a restaurant and service was terrible, the food was cold, nobody seemed to want to be there. People who are happy, people who go above and beyond, people who are constantly coming up with suggestions to improve the company, those are examples of hiring the right people. Satisfied customers indicate you're probably hiring the right people. So think about well-run companies and you'll come back to the idea that HR is important, how you recruit is important. We're not going to spend a lot of time on unions and collective bargaining, not because they're not important and not because they're not relevant, but because this is an intro to HR class. Individuals who choose to join an organization to help them bargain as a collective unit are members of labor unions. Here's what that means. If I am not a member of a labor union and my company is not a union shop, for example, I have to negotiate directly with my employer. My employer has more leverage because they control my paycheck, they can control my contract. I don't have strength in numbers. People who are members of a labor union can get together and collectively bargain, and what that means is if everybody in a particular unit of a company is a member of a labor union, it means not one person is going up against an employer, but maybe 10 or 100 or 1,000 are going up against management. Why are there fewer unions today? Well, to be honest, unions mainly took hold in industrial sectors such as steel and coal, And those industries are largely going away in the United States. There still are powerful unions, make no mistake. The most powerful and most numerous white-collar union is the National Education Association, which is teachers. But we still have the United Auto Workers, United Steel Workers, all these unions who still collectively bargain, but it's different than it used to be. Here's one of the other sides, though. The advantage to being a member of a labor union is, yes, you can collectively bargain. Yes, you generally make more money. Yes, you generally have better job stability. The downsides to labor unions are, yes, you've got to pay union dues, because unions are businesses too. So you've got to pay your union dues out of your paycheck to keep your union protection. Unions also mean if you are not happy, you cannot directly negotiate with your own employer. You got to go through your union. And unions also have a reputation of also protecting poor performers as well. So again, in terms of what unions push for, unions want grievance procedures. In other words, if there is a problem, a disagreement between an employee and an employer, they want a process for being able to go through complaints, so somebody doesn't just get fired. They want job security, they want better benefits, and they want higher pay. And again, if you are getting into a union, this is the employer arguments against this stuff, that basically you don't get merit pay increases. Good performers don't always get pay increases. Pay is based largely on security, and again, you don't have flexibility. A lot of folks who are not fans of unions, for example, say it reduces the ability of companies to be flexible. If you're locked into a collective bargaining agreement with a labor union, for example, you may not be able to easily hire or fire people during economic upturns or downturns as well. So in terms of the organizing process, again, unions make contact with people working in a company. There's a voting process, and it goes through the National Labor Relations Board. Again, not spending a lot of time on this, not because it's not important, but because this is a very limited scope we're looking at for this class. And again, in terms of collective bargaining, all that means is that you as members of a labor union are going to work with the company and collectively bargain for a labor contract for your employees. Grievance procedures, again, tend to be a kind of a judicial process, and it can end up with, let's say for example, somebody feels they were treated unfairly at work, they should have gotten a raise, or that they were unfairly criticized. They might start off by going to their local union shop steward. It starts off oral, goes to writing. Then we get into to more representative types of discussion, and it could finally end in arbitration, which means we actually get an outside entity to come in, a federal arbitrator to come in and negotiate between labor and management. Again, I don't mean to say this stuff isn't important, but we're covering this for the idea more of your general awareness than getting into actual union negotiation. So what can a union do? A union, if they're not happy with labor strategies, for example, if they're not happy with the way the company is treating them, they can go on strike. People can boycott other companies. They can picket. They can also lead PR campaigns against a particular company, for example. We're getting to the last section now, guys, and this is where we get into some important laws that people who are practitioners of HR need to be aware of. With the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1935, that was where the minimum wage came from. So in other words, we didn't have a 40-hour work week or a minimum wage before the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1935. Then we had the Equal Pay Act of 1963, and literally in the United States, it was okay to pay women less than men for doing the same job strictly based on gender until 1963. Remember this, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Title VII, is the most important piece of HR and civil rights legislation ever passed in the United States, and basically means that you cannot discriminate or on hiring or treatment or pay based on somebody's skin color, based on their ethnic origin, based on their gender, any of those things. And it was amended by the Supreme Court. It was interpreted to say that also provides protection based on sexual orientation at this point in time too. So somebody who identifies as gay, lesbian, transgender are all protected under the Civil Rights Act of 1964 under Title VII. When we see the term protected class, that means categories by which employers need to be aware of not discriminating. Anybody basically who is a protected class is somebody I want to put this in terms that make sense because this is not an HR class. Typically speaking, the law favored white males up until 1964. And in 1964, it basically said if you are in a category that does not position you as a white male, you cannot be treated differently in the employment process than a white male. And that's really what it comes down to. So the protected classes based on gender, based on ethnic background, based on skin color, based on religion, based on, at this point, sexual identity. And so all of those things are covered under the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And then we get to the Americans with Disabilities Act. That meant that basically employers had to be inclusive. You cannot refuse to hire somebody simply because they have a disability. An example might be if somebody applied for a job as a secretary or an office manager and they use a wheelchair. It is not acceptable to say, well, wheelchairs don't fit in our elevators. Not acceptable. There needs to be equal opportunities for people with disabilities as well, within reason. You have to be able to show, for example, that you can do the job. It's completely acceptable for an employer to ask somebody to prove they can do the job. One of the interesting parts, however, though, is even if you believe somebody has a disability, you cannot regard them as having a disability until they themselves identify themselves as being disabled. Something to keep note of. So what are some of the changing trends? Well, we're becoming a more diverse country, which is great. In terms of the most quickly growing ethnic group, people who identify as Hispanic in the United States. So we're going to have a majority Hispanic population, a majority non-white population by the time we get into the 2030s and 2040s in the United States. We're more diverse. We have more single parents, and that's not just females, but males too. What does that mean? We may need more flexible working schedules. And in terms of diversity too, the quickest growing religions in the United States are atheism and Islam, which means if you've got somebody who practices Islam, you may need to provide more flexible break schedules. You have more individuals over the age of 65 who are coming back to the workplace. What does that mean? Well, you might need to train them in technology or provide them flexible work schedules for things like doctor's appointments. And why are more older individuals coming back? Because we're living longer and people either need more money, they need health care, or they get bored. And everybody likes flexible work schedules. That's something that's sort of universal across the demographics. And again, we talked about some of the key laws. I'm not going to read these to you here. I do want you to remember that the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Title VII, is the most important piece of civil rights legislation ever passed in the United States regarding human resource management. And again, there are lots of important laws. One I will hit on real quick, the Family Medical Leave Act of 1993 means if you have a serious medical condition or are caring for a family member who has a serious medical condition, you are eligible as a full-time employee for up to 12 weeks of unpaid leave without your job being in question. So other key concepts, anytime you have people with diverse backgrounds and skills, you're making your organization stronger. It's better to have people who have differing skill sets and different backgrounds, different approaches to life. As the minimum wage creeps up, and there's been a bigger push for the minimum wage, for example, we're seeing more folks who are finding their jobs are either being outsourced or getting self-service. If you want to know why there's so many touchscreens in McDonald's and Taco Bell, it's because employers are preparing for a $15 minimum wage, for example. The flip side is we expect more from our companies. We want companies to be more open and transparent with how they hire, with how they pay. We want to have better organizational cultures, ones that support diversity and inclusion. And in addition, people, especially people under the age of 30, want to be belong to companies or be parts of companies that they believe in. And everybody wants a flexible schedule, even us old Gen Xers. I thank you today for your time and attention. I hope you have a great day.